Welcome to Encounter Church. We're going to start by singing some songs. I would love it if you would stand up and sing with us.
Darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger, the King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder and leaves us breathless in awe and wonder, the King of glory, the King above all kings. Yeah, this is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Who brings our chaos back into order? Who makes the orphan a son and daughter? The King of glory, the King of glory, who rules the nations with truth and justice, shines like the sun in all of its brilliance. The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy, worthy. Oh, this is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Sometimes on this journey, I get lost in my mistakes. What looks to me like weakness is a canvas for your strength. My story isn't over, my story's just begun. Failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. No, failure won't define me, 'cause that's what my Father does. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house. Check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Arrival's not the end game, the journey's where you are. You never wanted perfect, you just wanted my heart. And the story isn't over if the story isn't good. Failure's never final when the Father's in the room. No, failure's never final when the Father's in the room. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Ooh, here in the Father's house. Check your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. Prodigals come home, the helpless find hope. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Prison doors fling wide, the dead come to life. Love is on the move when the Father's in the room. Miracles take place, the cynical find faith. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Jericho walls are quaking, strongholds now are shaking. Love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Oh, love is breaking through when the Father's in the room. Ooh, lay your burdens down. Your shame at the door, 'cause it ain't welcome anymore. Ooh, you're in the Father's house. You are not hidden. There's never been a moment you were forgotten. You are not hopeless. You have been broken, your innocence stolen. I hear you whisper underneath your breath. I hear your SOS, your SOS. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true, I will rescue you. distance cannot be covered over and over. You're not defenseless. I'll be your shelter, I'll be your armor. I hear you whisper underneath your breath. I hear your SOS, your SOS. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the dark night. It's true, I will rescue you. I will never stop finding you in the middle of the hardest fight. It's true, I will rescue you. Hear the whisper underneath your breath. I hear you whisper, you have nothing left. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true, I will rescue you. I will never stop marching to reach you in the middle of the hardest fight. It's true, I will rescue you. Oh, I will rescue you. You may be seated.
For thousands of years, humanity has endured every environment the world has to offer and has adapted, innovated, and overcome. And still, to this day, it struggles to understand its most complex challenge: people. This species can propel itself to the moon and back, yet fail even the most basic of social cues, transforming into abominations of themselves, such as the close talker,
Like my Instagram post yet. Why haven't you liked it yet? Can you go ahead and...
the office leech,
Hey, what's going on? Nothing? Cool. Dude, CrossFit this morning, totally bonkers. You been working out? Good talk.
and the dreaded bathroom conversationalist.
Bro, I like those shoes. Hey, do you have some chapstick I can borrow?
But there is hope, because we all struggle navigating the difficulties of relationships. Friendships are good, but we need people skills to make them great.
Good morning. Welcome to Encounter Church. My name is Chris Causey. I'm the lead pastor here. And if today's your first day, I just want to welcome you. We look forward to hopefully meeting you. I have a gift for you right after the service. Because we, as a church, we love people. And we believe this is a place where people should be able to walk in the doors and feel loved. But let's just be honest, people are tricky, right? Life would be so much easier without the people part of it. I mean, Monday we were driving to the airport. My wife and I were going to a conference this week, and it's rush hour, and we're like merging over, and it's like one after the other, and kind of doing the zipper merge, and this guy was like really angry. I could tell behind me that I was trying to merge. He was really offended that the road I was on was ending, and it was going to interfere with the road he was on. And so I have a Buick LeSabre, which is this kind of the second cousin of a tank. And so I'm like naturally like, look, bro, you got a BMW. I got a Buick LeSabre from 2003. whose feelings are going to be hurt more in this thing, right? And so I'm just kind of merging over while he's like trying to not let me merge over. So we get over, and he whips around and kind of kicks it. And it's like, okay, you know, like, sorry I got in front of you. And then he gets right back in front of me. Like, it's like, really, like, he had to have that spot. Like, the universe had bequeathed that to him. And I look over at Jenny, I was like, hey, want to have some fun? And I was like, what if I whip out and get right back in front of him and we do this all the way to the airport? And she was like, you are not doing that. I was like, imagine how fun this could be. He is clearly so angry at me right now. And we could just mess with him all the way there. And we were like talking. She was like, you're going to get us killed. But what was fascinating to me was I was like driving there and he's like going off and, you know, my wife was not going to let me have fun. And I'm like, that guy's day got interrupted. Like like a burst of anger came out of nowhere. And if I'm being honest, a burst of anger came out of nowhere in me too, because I would have found it very rewarding to have gotten right back in front of him and slowed down. Can I just confess that out loud? It would have been very rewarding to have like beep, 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 and just put it on cruise control and done the slow thing all the way there. I did not, because I have been coming all month to our series called People Skills, and I know that would have not been the right thing to do. In fact, last week, and less than 24 hours after this, kind of prior to that moment on the interstate, I'd read these words to you about how to deal with conflict. If you were here last week, it was, therefore, Paul writes in Colossians 3, and it's one of the things that's helpful to know about this letter specifically is Paul writes to a group of people in a city called Colossae, and which sounds like something from Lord of the Rings. It's kind of an epic title. Anyways, and so he's writing to them, and they're a group of people who are following Jesus. They've become Christians, and they're in a context where there's a lot of confusion around Christianity because this is the ancient world. There's a lot of kind of different views about the afterlife and about gods and how these gods work. And you've had the Greek and the Roman influence that has this pantheon, Zeus with his lightning bolt and Jupiter and Saturn and all the things that we named the planets after. Like, that's all part of their mix. And so there's a lot of confusion when it comes to theology. And Colossae is one of those places where there's a ton of confusion because there wasn't a lot of Jewish influence, and so it wasn't like Christianity was growing out of a Jewish thought pattern, which it had in other cities. So what happens is some people rise to the power levels of, their personalities, the power dynamics. They get into leadership, and they really start to distort Christianity. So religion can be a powerful force for controlling people. Right? This is what human beings have done for thousands of years. And at the beginning of Christianity, when it's starting to spread, people recognized Christianity could be used to distort and control. And so these leaders step into this church, and they invent all these rituals that are required for you to be okay with God. Because the thing with a ritual is ultimately, in the day, if you can position yourself as a gatekeeper, you can control people. If they need you to be okay with God, then naturally your power dynamic, your stock rises. And this is what they were doing. They're inventing all these religious rituals that were not required. They were not in the New Testament. There was no kind of prior kind of outline in Jesus' teachings that this is important and this is what we should do. But nonetheless, they invent it. And not only do they invent new rituals, they invent new distortions around who Jesus is and what spirituality is. And by the time they finish, this church had gotten really sideways. And these religious leaders had made it all about the things you have to do for me to say you're okay with God. And Paul hears about it, and he writes a letter, and he spends the first portion of the letter correcting them, being like, this is not what Christianity is. Christianity is the good news, and he unpacks that. And then he systematically kind of destroys the arguments that these others had constructed. And he spends the rest of the letter saying, hey, look, I know you got sucked into this distortion because you really want to live a life that honors God. you really want to please him, you're following Jesus, let me help you do that. And one of the biggest areas, naturally, is in the relational sphere. And so Paul turns to this aspect of the Christian faith in Colossians 3. Now, what's fascinating is the same struggles 2,000 years ago is the same struggles Christianity has globally today. There are still kind of branches of Christian thought that have rituals and religious rites that completely control the gates of heaven and hell, that if you don't do this, then this person with this power can stop you from getting in. And there's still crazy distortions around who Jesus is that's in kind of what would essentially kind of meet the definition of like cults associated with Christianity. So this isn't a new thing. This isn't an old thing. This is just what humans do. We love power and we love control. And Christianity is just one of the ways, one of the many ways humans have sought to do that. And so Paul fixes that and says, here's what it looks like to live out the Christian faith in reality. And he marks himself, and this is a passage we looked at last week. He said, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if you have any grievance against someone. So he's in this passage, in this kind of description of relational, what does it look like to live out Christianity, and he gets to conflict in this passage. And one of the things that I said last week is that conflict, for the default for us, even in the etymology of the word, the root of conflict is a word associated with warfare. But in reality, that conflict in the Christian way is about the wardrobe. He says, clothe yourselves with humility, compassion. He says, these virtues change how you walk in the situations. It changes how you live out conflict. This morning, just confession time, right? I accused my daughter of something she didn't do. And it sounded like, I don't know if any of you have, I told you last week, I have like a tool belt and I have a hammer in it, right? Like that's my tool. So if I want to get something, I pull the hammer out and I'm like, you're going to listen, right? Like that, not a literal hammer, like a figurative hammer, right? But like that's my like go-to is the hammer. And my wife is so much more relationally skilled than I am, and she's got all these different tools and knows how to do it and navigate it and get down on one knee and quieten her voice and do all these Jedi mind tricks relationally with people. And I just have a hammer. I like give you a stare, I say it really firm, and I expect that you're going to crack like some Law and Order episode, right? And it doesn't work. And so, it didn't work. I went back to the bedroom, continued to get ready because I've got to talk about conflict. And so my wife comes in and is like, Chris, like you almost made our daughter cry. And she was like, you went in there and like, I don't know if your goal was to come in like a force of nature and make accusations. And I was like, no, that wasn't my goal. My goal was to ask a question. Like I went in there wanting to know an answer to a question I had. And she was like, well, you did not accomplish that goal. Like, you were trying to break our daughter like she had committed some crime and she needed to confess. So I had to walk in there this morning and kind of sat down in front of her and said, sweetie, I'm so sorry. Daddy was wrong. Daddy, the way I said that wasn't right. What I was trying to do was ask you a question, but I recognized that ultimately what I came across like was somebody from a television episode trying to make you confess to a crime you didn't commit. That was wrong. Please forgive me. And she was like, I forgive you, Dad. And I was like, good. Now I can go to church, right? It's the reality is that like conflict is one of those areas where when we put on the wardrobe, even if it's a little too late, like what I did, it changes the dynamic. And what we ultimately, why we wanted to focus on this as people skills in the last 2 weeks and not talk about all the positives like, oh, we should love, and is that reality is that oftentimes relationships, they don't die in one single swoop. They die through paper cuts. Little tiny moments of unresolved conflict, of undealt with issues. And it hit me even as I walked away from my daughter, like so grateful that my wife is so much smarter than me and told me that. Because I was like, this is how you lose a child. Not at one time, but 100 of those at a time. And it creates a slow distance that grows. And it's like, I was just like genuinely thankful. Like, God, thank you so much that you spared me that this morning. And what Paul does is he doesn't just end with this passage like, oh, if you just wear this wardrobe, it's all going to be great and grand. He doesn't. He continues because he recognizes that the quality of our relationships affects the quality of our lives. Like, this is really essential. This is really important. And if we can learn how not just to deal with conflict, but to deal with the second part of conflict, what I had to do today, in fact, the part that he goes to next when he says, bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. He's assuming the conflict doesn't go well. There hasn't been resolution. There's still a tension relationally. What do you do? If you remember last week, I kind of highlighted Paul's word choice with the word grievance. The word grievance, kind of the root of that in the language of the day was like to grab someone's throat. It was like it wasn't a small thing. It was you wanted to choke them. You were so angry at them. So there's this really kind of clear heaviness to the conflict that's present in this passage and the imagery that he chooses. And so the question is, like, how do we continue through this? And he says, first, you want to bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you. So this word bear kind of has this weightiness. It means you're willing to kind of carry something heavy and endure something that's painful. But I think this is also a really good illustration for the tension that many of us have when we think about this idea of forgiveness. And in some ways, it's even at the very beginning, just for us English speakers, right? When you read bear with each other, you did not think this. Right? You didn't see bear with each other and you're like, oh, that's it. That's the answer for relational health. Hanging out with a bear. Because that's what Paul said. Right? I just want to highlight, this guy is accurately reflecting what would happen if he just were hanging out with a bear. This guy's face is funny to me. Like, he's just like, maybe he's like, this is how it ends, right? I mean, the bear's about to eat me. But this was not what Paul was saying. He was not bear with each other. He had a different idea, and it's like words matter. And the definition you ascribe to a word really matters. And I think, because I've read the dictionary definition of the word forgive, that this is one of those areas where the definition really does matter. And how we understand this word really matters. And any conversation around the word forgive, I think, should require us to first define it. So here's what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not forgetting. You'll hear people say, you should forgive and forget. As if somehow our brains are a computer memory disk that we can just kind of highlight the file and drop it into the trash and then, double click the trash and really delete the file. But we know that logically that doesn't work. Like, if our brains had been wired, forget any pain that happens to you, none of us would have made it to age 5. Right? We would have gotten hurt. We'd have been like, oh, we're going to forget that. And then we go get hurt again. Right? And at the end of the day, like, what has prompted you needing to forgive someone is emotional, relational pain. And just in case you disagree with that, and you would say, oh, it's not pain. Our brain does not distinguish the difference between relational, emotional pain and physical pain. They've done studies. If you take Tylenol, it decreases relational pain. They've seen that in the laboratory. Our brains do not distinguish the difference. Okay, so neurologically speaking, this is ridiculous. You do not forget what has been done to you. And the bigger the action or actions that have been done to you, the more the impossibility of you ever forgetting what happened to you. So clearly when we say the word forgive, we're not saying forget. Nor are we saying excuse. Because you feel the tendency, oh, if I forgive them, I'm excusing it. It's like, no, you're not excusing when you forgive. You're not saying it was okay. In our household, this is something we intentionally do when we are dealing with an issue and our kids are confessing something wrong and we're kind of navigating that. We do not say the phrase, "It's okay." Because it's not okay. What was done was wrong. It was not right. It caused relational distance. It caused emotional pain. So we don't want to excuse it, which is our tendency. We're like, "Oh, it's like, I'm sorry, I forgive you." And it's like, well, no, it's okay. Because we don't want to see someone else in pain. We don't see someone else kind of in an awkward place. So we're like, "No, it's okay, it's okay." That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is not excusing. When something's been done wrong to you, you don't excuse it. And nor is it enabling, which is this kind of second tier to excusing. If someone does something wrong to you and forgive them, you're not giving them permission to keep doing it. You're not saying, "Oh, the way you talked to me was verbally abusive. I forgive you." You're not saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm giving you permission to continue to talk to me like that." That is not forgiveness either. It is not an enabling act, nor is it foregoing justice. You can be a victim of a crime and forgive the perpetrator and still expect that the perpetrator goes to prison. That's not what forgiveness is either. And I think this is really helpful to understand because we get really sideways. And one of the biggest areas where we get sideways in the definition of forgiveness is this. We think, and even dictionaries, like respected dictionaries, will call forgiveness an emotion. Forgiveness is not a feeling, which is the biggest trap of them all. Because if you've ever had to forgive someone for something they've done to you, the last thing that you normally feel in the moment is a lot of happiness for them or towards them. It's normally the feeling to want to choke them, not hug them. And when you sit across from someone who tells you, "Well, you just need to stop being angry at them and forgive them," they are confusing what forgiveness actually is, because it is not an emotional thing. I mean, some of you have walked through trauma, and there is an intentional kind of process you're working through forgiveness, and you still have the ongoing feelings that you have to deal with. Feelings are just gauge indicators telling us something's not right. So if forgiveness is not these things, then what is it? I think this is a simple definition, but it's loaded in the words. Forgiveness is canceling the debt owed to you. Canceling the emotional debt, the relational debt owed to you. And here's what I mean. When you have been wronged, you have to recognize and acknowledge the wrong. You're not excusing it. You're not downplaying it. The reason forgiveness is such a challenge is because when you and I have been wronged, we have a strong impulse to want to make it right. And if it's not made right, we feel very wrong about that. Like, this is not okay. And there's an element of justice rooted in that justice has been violated, that you were treated less than the dignity and worth of someone made in the image of God, or what was done to you was not okay, or maybe it was even illegal. And that there is a debt that actually happens. That there is they've done something, they owe you something. And I would argue that the longer this debt goes unresolved, it's compounding. What was done to you, a year later, it feels even bigger. And the debt's even larger because you're collecting interest on it. But it's not on their ledger book, it's on yours. You're keeping track of it. And the word canceling, so what's fascinating is the first part of this passage assumes that maybe reconciliation happens. Reconciliation takes at least two people, Like this morning, I had reconciliation with my daughter. I wronged her. She had a debt that I had incurred a debt in her relational book. And that debt caused distance relationally. And we see this play out, right? When someone hurts you, you don't want to make eye contact. You physically will distance yourselves from them when you get around because there's a relational distance that's already present. Right? That's reconciliation when you're able to recover and return, like how I left this morning. But notice that this forgiveness in itself, the act of forgiveness, does not require two people, it requires one. Forgiveness is your canceling. You choose to cancel the debt. You make the choice. You decide. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. Sometimes the bearing with each other means you overlook an offense. You recognize they've had a bad day, or like the guy, right, I told you about last Monday. There was a small debt. It wasn't big, but when he cut back in front of me, I was like, dude, you're a jerk. And I felt it. I felt the debt show up in my anger and my irritation. That was the debt manifesting. So what I had to do is overlook it. How did I overlook it? I made a joke about it. Because I felt it. I was bothered that this guy had offended me. I felt offended. And I was like, this is dumb. I am not going to let that guy's bad day touch my day. I am sitting in the car with my bride, and there are no kids behind us, and we're going to be together all week. And it's like I got my playlist ready. I got good things planned. I'm excited about being with my woman. I love her. She's my favorite person on planet Earth. And I'm not going to let some dude who is looking at morning traffic as if it's some like Formula racing, and he just lost a position in the top 10. Like, that's just dumb. I'm like, man, I like what I got going on right beside me. I'm not going to let the dude behind me take that from me. And bro, if you get in front of me, that's okay. Because what I got beside me is better than what just happened in front of me. And so I made a joke. And then I made my wife laugh. Because that's like, if you look on the top 5 list of my favorite things to do on planet Earth, making my wife laugh is like one of them. I wake up every day being like, how can I make her laugh? Like, I enjoy making her laugh. It's fun. And so it was a small debt. But there's other levels of debt where you can't just overlook it. You can't laugh your way out of it. And it comes to you intentionally saying, they wronged me. I deserve better. I forgive them. And this is not easy, nor is this a one-time thing. This oftentimes is a regular thing that you have to continue to do with each new wave of emotion washing over you and each new memory reminding you of what they've done to you. And you choosing when the memory flies in and settles in the nest to say, I forgive you for that. Naming what that is and letting it go. And I recognize that's challenging. And sometimes that looks like a war zone inside of your mind in the battle that you have to do. But I've walked this. My dad, who abandoned my mom and me before I was born, when I was 20 years old, reached out to my mom and said, hey, I'd like to start a relationship with Chris. I'd just become a Christian, and the idea that like my father, who I'd never known my entire life, would actually want to know me was kind of really exciting, if I can just be honest with you. Because it's amazing. You can never know someone, and there can be a hole because of it. And so there was this hole inside of me. And I thought, man, I'm finally going to get to know my dad. Like, that's such a cool thing. And I think I would have probably been a daddy's boy growing up if I'd had one. Because I love, like, all the stuff that you think of, like, stereotypically of what dads would do. I would have been all about it. And I didn't have it. And I felt it. And I saw my friends and what they had, and I was like, man, that would have been so cool to learn how to fix a car or learn how to repair stuff. That would have just been amazing. And so we talk on the phone. And it's like 20 minutes, and he's an intellectual, and I can kind of pick up on that. But he's like kind of being sort of invasive. He's not going anywhere relationally. It's all just kind of, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing, talk about me, and he's sharing who he is. And he's like, hey, good news, I'm going to be passing through where you are, would love to meet you. And I fall asleep that night with the phone beside my ear because I really don't want to miss the phone call. And I wake up the next morning and I check the list and he didn't call. He didn't call the next day or the next day or the next day or the next day or ever again. And then I get an email out of the blue a year later from a friend of his saying, your dad is so offended at you. He offered an olive branch to you and you didn't take it. You are the reason this relationship never happened. I felt like somebody was shooting me. It was just, I was like, dude. And unfortunately, it was like way back in the day, when computer monitors weighed 500 pounds. They were massive things. So I couldn't have picked it up and thrown it across the room because I'd have probably pulled something in my back. But that's what I wanted to do. All I could do was go delete. It was not even satisfying. Right? And I was so hurt. And I remember working through that process to forgive him. Literally, if God could do a spiritual x-ray right now, you wouldn't find a trace of bitterness inside of me towards him. I've forgiven him. I worked through that process. When the waves, I could even talk about it right now, and there's no ill will towards him. But that was a long journey. And I remember realizing one day when it was really obvious that the choices I had made to forgive him were finally crystallizing inside of my body. When my daughter was born, and I was singing one night, rocking her, and she was sick and wasn't calming down, and it felt so powerless. And in the moment, I was like, man, if I could just run away right now, I would. I totally would, because I feel so powerless right now. I can't help this little girl, but I just kept singing louder and louder, and it was a song that I'd picked because of the grief I'd walked through with my dad. And it's a song that if you were ever go in her bedroom today, I have an incredible assistant, and one of her gifts to our kids was she knows that I sing over my children. And she had our song, the song that I sing to each one of them, turned into this really cool poster that hangs in each one of their rooms. And it was the song, Jason Mraz, I Won't Give Up on Us, right? And it was just this really powerful declaration. I'm singing it over, she's barely, she's at this point, I think, 16 days on planet Earth. And she's already beginning to break me. And I remember just singing louder and louder and louder, and then I just started crying out of nowhere. Because I realized that my dad never got the experience of what I just had when my daughter calmed down in my arms. Let's just be real. If you're a parent and you have a kid who finally goes still in your arms because your love and your presence calm them, that might be the greatest feeling on planet Earth. There's no gold medal that can compare to realizing, I just did that. Boom! You want to be like, woo! But they're asleep, so you can't. It's just silent fist pumping. And there's nobody around at the moment. But the wave that hit me was of pity for my dad. That he never tasted that. He never got to experience any of that. And I said to my wife last night when I was talking about sharing this illustration, I was like, I still feel even more pity today for him. It's just sadness. Because I have the two greatest kids on planet Earth. I've got a daughter who is so Ella. She's just her. And then I got a son. My mom's keeping our kids this past week, and my mom sends me a picture, and it's my son. I can't show you the picture because it's not PG-13. And so we got this glass pane separating our living room and our kitchen, and his naked butt is pressed up against the glass pane because he's taken off his pants and he doesn't want her to come in the living room, and so he uses his naked butt cheeks to hold the door closed. And she just sends us a picture of that, and she's like, I have no words for what's happening right now. And I'm like, he missed out on that. He missed out on all of that. And it was a long journey of me deciding every single moment the wave would wash over me that I was not going to hold his debt any longer. And I was going to cancel it. And in choosing to cancel it over and over, recognizing it was owed to me, I had a right to it, but I did not want it anymore. Because the reason God understood the power of forgiveness as a relational people skill was because God understands what happens when we don't. So, I love science. You probably have picked up on that if you've been here more than like a week. So this is a really fascinating cell that you and I have in our body. It's a group of cells. There's a range of them. So quick backdrop on how your immune system works. Your immune system is probably one of the most amazing systems that have ever been designed. I mean, it's mind-blowing when we don't even fully comprehend the immune system because that's how complex it is. And so you've got two different systems that are operating when you get sick. The second system is the one that's like the power system that's really the one that produces antibodies and kind of does the like SEAL team, strike force style. And this is like one of the SEAL team members. So when your body gets sick, actually when your body's not sick, you have every single cell in your body, almost every single one of them, has this built-in mechanism for protection. And what it is imagine your cell has a glass window. And because cells can't be seen through, because you can't like log in and check what's happening inside of a cell, and if there's a virus or a bacteria hiding inside running kind of a devastating, replicating machinery hijack, what your body does as a protective mechanism is it periodically grabs a protein that's been made by your cell and it displays it on the window. It sticks it outside the cell in a receptor. And these type of cells walk by. And imagine they're the policemen patrolling at night with their flashlight. And they're just looking at the proteins because if everything looks okay, this cell's okay. This cell's okay. You have a certain T cell that does this, and the T cell kind of walks through and is like, yep, all these look good. But you've ever seen the spy movies where they when they're breaking into the heist, they'll record a video and then they hijack and they play the video over and over and it's like a loop? Right, so it looks like everything's okay. Viruses do something essentially equivalent to that. They'll hide, they hijack, and they prevent the cell from showing some of the proteins being produced. It's genius from the virus's standpoint. But this sucker right here, he's called a natural killer cell. He's like the FBI. He's walking, he's like, whoa, hold up. That video just looped. That's not normal. These proteins are not normal. There should be more going on here. Something suspicious, right? This is the one who catches the virus as being really sneaky, that have hijacked our video surveillance system and is running a loop so nothing in our body knows it's happening, right? So you've got a few sicknesses that do that really well. So what the natural killer cell does, which by the way is an awesome name, is exactly what its name says. It walks up and if it detects anything that seems off, it's like, boop, boop, and it injects a command, a protein, that essentially destroys the cell, or commands the cell to destroy itself. It's this brilliant way of your body protecting itself. Because if the virus can't continue to multiply, then killing one cell prevents tens of thousands of others from being destroyed. So, in some ways, forgiveness is a lot like a natural killer cell. Because what happens when you don't forgive is resentment starts to multiply inside of you. You ever held on to something? You start to regurgitate in your mind. You hear what they said to you. You replay what they did to you. And forgiveness is us intentionally saying, I'm canceling that debt. I'm not going to allow it to replicate and grow because I understand what happens if I don't deal with it. Because resentment, not dealt with, turns into bitterness. And resentment is focused specifically on what they did, but bitterness is a root. In fact, the New Testament calls it a root. And it goes into everything. And a root's underneath the surface, you don't notice it, but if you've ever walked by a sidewalk, even 5-10 feet away from a tree and it's starting to lift up, you're seeing the effects of what roots can do. They grow underneath the surface and they start to take root, and the roots eventually start to do damage on things that are not even close to the tree. And bitterness, because we've all had these moments where we've met people who are bitter. And it's like they're bitter at the relationship that went south, but that bitterness has crept into other areas of their life. It's turned into a bigger thing than the original thing that happened. And forgiveness is that natural killer cell recognizing, like, hey, we got to stop this now, because if not, it's gonna explode and it's gonna keep growing. And bitterness, not dealt with, eventually turns into hatred. Hatred's this kind of cancer, calcification. It just sets in. And at this point, you don't even care about the person anymore. And that anger, or the low-grade anger, like hatred, that kind of lives. Eventually, what happens, you get into this dangerous way of living, ledger living, where you're keeping track of what's been done against you, who wronged you, what they owe you. And this thing is growing and growing and growing inside of you. And it keeps getting bigger. Corrie ten Boom, who was a famous Christian who lost her family in a concentration camp. After the war was over, she kind of grew to international prominence, writing about forgiveness and talking about the Christian faith, and how her Christian faith that she had experienced was helping her process through what had been done to her family. She watched them die in a concentration camp. And lo and behold, she's speaking one night, and someone walks up to her, and he was one of the Nazi commanders inside the concentration camp where she lost her family. And he walked up to her one night, and he reached his hand out to shake his hand. He says, I just want to say I'm so sorry for what I did. It was just kind of, Corrie ten Boom was writing later about the moment and how nothing in her wanted to reach her hand out. Because she's like, you're responsible for me being the orphan that I am. And then she went back to all that she'd thought about with forgiveness and what it really represented, and she reached her hand out, and she said when she did, she just felt this wave of freedom wash over her. Because she was not going to hold that ledger. She's not going to let that thing inside of her take control anymore. And that gave her a freedom. And this idea of forgiveness, in some ways, just for you to know, a lot of times forgiveness is not about the other person. It's you. And Paul doesn't address a you plural in this passage. He's talking to you singular. Because God recognizes what happens if we don't. You keep expecting that their life is going to go south because of the debt that you continue to carry for them. It's not. You keep waiting for the day they call you. But the problem is, by the time they call you, if they ever call you, that debt has continued to get interest in it. And guess what? When they finally apologize, it doesn't satisfy as much as you thought it would. Because there's the interest too. You've wasted your life thinking about what they've done, replaying it over and over inside of your mind. And so when God's outlining this through Paul as the ultimate people skill, because this is the immune system of relationships. This is how relationships stay healthy. He's painting this picture, and then he gives them the final piece, the one I want to close out with that I think is so essential. He says, forgive. He's already told them, now he's going to tell them how. He's going to say, forgive as the Lord forgave you. His starting point for the command is who's forgiven them. So this past week, I'm sure that your televisions and your news feeds were filled with this. This is the final resting place of Elizabeth II, right? Longest reigning monarch. It's just this big ordeal over there, and it was a big ordeal over here with the kind of the newscast. But when she passed away, not all the reception to her death was good. there's a complicated history that England has around the world. And there's even complicated views about the monarchy inside of England. So there were points this week where I remember watching her coffin is riding by, and a handful of people are screaming at her and kind of saying some things that in other contexts would have been statements that you'd be like, oh, okay, there's some frustration or anger there. But what was happening that was a little kind of made the international news was people were screaming and holding up signs against her, and cops would arrest them because it's illegal in that moment. They'd kind of decided that during this period of mourning, you can't say anything negative about Queen Elizabeth II. And the idea is clearly like the woman is dead. It's not like she's riding in the coffin and like, oh, I'm so offended at what they just said to me. She didn't hear it. But the idea was what she represented was a really important thing in their national law system. And so the nature of what she represented meant that anything done to her had a special offense associated with it. Right? So you may not agree with that, but we can kind of relate to that if you decided to do something against the President of the United States, right? If you, people who try to assassinate the President of the United States, or people who even make statements about the President of the United States in a threatening manner, they will get visits from people wearing suits. Because the president represents not just the person, it's the nation. There's like a significance attached to the person, even if you don't agree with them politically. So this is a logic that's kind of globally has always been there. And I think in some ways that helps us to kind of jump up to understand why Paul is saying specifically what he's saying. Because fascinatingly so, this slab here that was laid over Queen Elizabeth this past week is called a ledger slab. The same word ledger that that we use in our ledger balance sheets. The etymology is the same. It means to lay down. This idea that in the course of life, there is ultimately this deeper ledger that we all hold. And this idea that if there is a God, so for those who are not sure about the Christian faith, let's just suspend your personal judgment and let's just go logically around Christian theology. So what we know true about presidents, queens, prime ministers, that whole idea that like to do something wrong or illegal against them has a special punishment associated because of the nature of what you're doing and who you're doing it against. Now, Paul says the Lord. Now, this was a picture taken in the last 2 weeks by the Webb telescope. Okay, this is not some like establishing shot on Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy or Avengers. Okay, this is a real thing. This is called the Tarantula Nebula. It's about 320 light years across. So the image you see, if light started here, 320 years later, it would get to the other side of the television. That's how big this thing is. Now, in the grand scheme of the universe, it's only 200,000 light years away from us. It's basically in our backyard. Because the universe itself is billions and billions of light years across. These blue little dots here are all new stars being formed. That's what's happening inside of this nebula. All this gorgeous dust you see is coalescing. And inside of these things are hard metals and even like just incredible consolidations where stars are literally being forged and formed right now. It's amazing. In Psalm 19, David is sitting and reflecting one day on who God is, and he looks up to the heavens and he says, the heavens declare your glory. Isaiah talks, who's another Old Testament writer, reflecting on the sky, looks at the stars and says, you made every single one of them. You call each one out by your power and your might. Now, if this is the God, if this is God, the one who made it, this is his handiwork and what he formed. And we hold people accountable for how they treat earthly leaders. What do you think logically would be the extent for what you would do to the cosmic being? And before you answer the question, let me add one other piece to that. If you're a parent and your kid really, really makes you mad, what they've done is really wrong to you. Have you ever uttered the phrase or had the phrase uttered to you, I brought you into this world? As if somehow implied, I can take you out too, right? But this idea that somehow, like as the creator, as your maker, I deserve certain respect and rights. You may not give this to your school teacher, you may not give this to the police, but you will give it to me because I made you. I mean, my mom would say that to me, son, I brought you into this world. I'm like, are you threatening to kill me? Well, I made you. You know, so in all of those arenas, what if some of those impulses we have actually help us to understand the bigger picture? That when we have done wrong, when we have sinned, anytime selfishness towards God or selfishness towards others, the word sin means, in the New Testament, they used an archery term that meant to miss the mark. So you didn't hit the bullseye. You were less than perfect. So anything that was not directly in line with perfection of who he is. Things that we call little lies. What if done to him, maybe they're not so little? Maybe it's the sign, maybe sin, more appropriately understood, is cosmic treason and rebellion. It's us literally saying to the Maker, far more than we ever said to our parents, you have no clue. We think we should be in control. You don't know what you're doing, God. I know my life. I don't want your guidelines. I'll establish my own. What if all that, just rolling with me logically here, is what sin actually is? Then what would have been his justified response towards us? What did we actually deserve if all that is true? Well, clearly, we don't want to be with him. So that's separation. But if he's God and everything good in this world came from him, then to be separated from the good means that the only thing that's left is the absence of good. And that's where we choose to want to be. But I think when Paul says, forgive as the Lord forgave you, he's completely reframing what forgiveness really is. He's saying, look, you know what? You're right. They do owe you $50, relationally, emotionally. But remember that the God of the universe stepped down onto the cross and forgave your trillions of dollars in debt towards him. So surely if the God who you owed trillions to forgave you, then surely you can forgive even those who owe you $1 million or $1 billion because of the extent of what you truly received from him. This is the logic of his letter. You don't have to agree with the Christian faith, but the Christian faith logically makes sense if you lean into it in a way that even our own lives testify. And if this is true, if you are a Christ follower, then the impulse to forgive isn't just because you know it's healthy for you. It isn't just because you know if you don't forgive, all these other things will start to creep into your soul. It's out of a place of gratitude that you can forgive. It's out of a place of humility in how much you've been forgiven that you can go in and ask others to forgive. The reason I was able to walk into that room this morning, because there's a part of you when you've wronged someone, you don't want to admit you're wrong. You had your reasons. You did it. You justify it. You know why you did it. And you're right and they're wrong for thinking it. And I felt that little whisper like, well, you're the parent. You can blah, 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 blah. You had a right to that. And instead of fixating on what I thought I had a right to, as a Christian, I constantly am reminded of all the wrongs that he forgave me for. And I was able to walk into the room this morning, not because I'm a bigger man, but because in the presence of the cross, I realized how big my sin was. and how little I actually am. And yet God loved me and forgave me for it. And so I was able to say to my little girl, I'm sorry, I was wrong. And this dynamic has the power to transform your marriage. I'm telling you, if you can learn how to say these 9 words, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I love you. And that'll transform your marriage. Those 9 words. Because the posture to know how to operate that way regularly does something to you. It'll transform how you parent. When you can tell your kids, I don't have it all figured out. I just love you and I want the best for you, and I'm trying to work through that as we work through this. It does something. In many ways, what Paul lays out for us, in continuation of what he laid out for us, we looked at last week, is the ultimate people skill. People walking in light of the grace of God and what was forgiven towards them, intentionally choosing to cancel the debt owed to them by others. It transforms everything. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for the way you care about those small moments like I experienced this morning, or the small moments that maybe we experienced in our own houses today, or this week with a loved one or a coworker. Thank you for the power of forgiveness. Thank you that ultimately, in the day, it's not the things that we confuse it to be, that we can be people who still have boundaries, we can be people who walk in wisdom, but that we do those things no longer chained and trapped by the resentment and the bitterness and the things that creep into our own life. Thank you, Jesus, for how you loved. Thank you for how you forgave. And thank you for the freedom that produces. And it's in your name, Jesus, the name that brings and breaks every chain, that we pray. Amen. I want to thank you for being here today and allowing me to kind of walk through kind of a heavy topic. And we want to wrap up today because we know that some of you, some things got stirred. Some memories, some thoughts, some people that maybe you've never even thought about forgiving. Or some things that you need, maybe you're just sitting beside your spouse and you just need to lean over before the song even starts and be like, yeah, what he said, that was me. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Right? I mean, it just, maybe that's the next step. But I don't want you to lose sight. God's goodness in forgiveness as a people skill is that it brings freedom. It removes the debt that we hold on our books, because the debt that was once held on his book is no longer there for us, for those who follow Jesus. And that forgiveness that we give others erases it, and we no longer have to carry their debt either. And so we wanted to sing today, and normally it's like reflective and more thoughtful, but today we just wanted to celebrate and just be reminded of freedom. Ultimately, God desires for us to live in freedom with what his forgiveness and his grace brings. So I want to invite you to stand, and our team is going to lead us and close out our time together just with a declaration and reminder of what good grace really does. Let's sing.
Step out of the grave, break into the wild, and don't be afraid. Run into wide open spaces, graces waiting for you. Dance like the weight has been lifted, graces waiting. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is your burdens, bring all of your scars. Come back to communion, come back to the start. Run into wide open spaces, graces waiting for you. Dance like the weight has been lifted, graces waiting. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Come out of the dark, just as you are, into the fullness of His love. Oh, the Spirit is here, let there be freedom. Let there be freedom. Yeah. Come on, let's put our hands together. Chains will fall, prisons shake at the sound of Jesus' name. Lives made whole, hearts awake at the sound of Jesus' name. Chains will fall, prisons shake at the sound of Jesus' name. Lives made whole, hearts awake at the sound of Jesus' name. Yeah. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Come out of the dark, just as you are, into the fullness of His love. Oh, the Spirit is here, let there be freedom. Let there be freedom. Let there be freedom. Just like the weight has been lifted, grace is waiting. Dance like the weight has been lifted, grace is waiting. Come on, church. Dance like the weight has been lifted, grace is waiting for you. Oh, dance like the weight has been lifted, grace is waiting. Oh, dance like the weight has been lifted, 'cause He did it. Yes, He did it. Oh, dance like the weight has been lifted. Grace is waiting. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord, there is freedom, there is freedom. Come out of the dark, just as you are, into the fullness of His love. Oh, the Spirit is here, let there be freedom. Let there be freedom. Yeah. Let there be freedom. Let there be freedom.
Do it. Just like, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you found that message as powerful and as helpful as I did. There's nothing like walking in freedom, free from bitterness, and not carrying any of that with us. This is unbelievable, but this is our last Sunday that we're meeting. It's almost October, which is crazy. Next Sunday, we'll start a new series. If you haven't met Chris, if you're new, he would love for you to stop by on your way out. He has a gift for you, and he would love to just chat with you and get to know you a little bit. We hope you have an awesome week and look forward to seeing you back next Sunday. God bless and take care.